Hey guys, so we are going to keep talking about medieval times, and in this lesson, we're going to focus on the church. When we say the church during this and subsequent lessons after this, we are only talking about the Roman Catholic religion because that's the only branch of Christianity at this time. Later on, we're going to study how the church breaks apart. We'll have then the Roman Catholics and then Protestant branches. So that'll include Lutherans and Baptists and fundamentalists and some others. And even the Catholic Church itself is going to actually break apart. So there'll be two separate ones. We'll have Eastern Orthodox and we'll have Roman Catholic. So for right now, when we say the church, we are only talking about the Roman Catholics. So as you can see, our very first part on our notes here says that the church dominates medieval life. So there's a couple of reasons why this happens, but the biggest one is primarily because when you're a peasant, life is not that fantastic for you. So you really look forward to religion for a handful of reasons. One, it obviously gives you hope that if you're going to achieve salvation, you're going to go to heaven and everything's going to be great. So it gives you that thing to look forward to. But also it gives you something to focus on even when things are just not great. Like you know that you're going to go to church services on Sunday and you're going to enjoy that. So first, let's focus on priests. So the parish priest is going to be the person, the clergyman, who is in your local parish, in your local church. They're going to run those weekly services for you, but they do lots of other things too. Sacraments are probably the most important thing that they are going to be doing for you. So in the Catholic Church, there are 7 sacraments that you have to receive or things that you have to do in the church in order to gain salvation and go to heaven. So it starts with baptism. Catholics baptize babies really young, like when they're very first born, pretty much. And they go on from there. There's some other ones too. There's confession and communion, anointing of the sick. There's 7, like I said, altogether. But it's up to the parish priest to be giving these to you. So this is a very important role because without the sacraments, you can't get into heaven. So that's going to come up again a little bit later in our notes here. Another thing that the parish priest did was actually run the schools. So this is not happening on the manor because if you are living on the manor, you're not getting any schooling. So this would only be happening when we have the cities that were outside of the manor. But don't forget, you're not going to be peasants forever. You're going to buck the system and get rid of it. So you guys will get to go to school soon enough. In addition, when we say that it's dominating life here, it's the center of social life. So you might not think about church as being necessarily a social center for you, but back then it especially was because this was the place where they gathered to celebrate. Obviously, Easter and Christmas, we talked about those. You get a whole week off for those of work. But also, if there is a birth or a wedding or any type of celebration, the church is actually the physical building is the place you're going to go. First of all, it's in the middle of everything. If you look at towns that have been around here for a couple of hundred years, like 200 years, the church is almost always dead center of what the original town, what the original city was. And that's because the churches were always the center of everything. Plus, it's like the only building big enough to house everybody at one time. So kind of like the wedding receptions, maybe you've gone to a wedding reception before in a church hall. That's basically what's going on here. So in addition to these priests, we are also going to have some other clergy, people who run church services, that are going to be important. So they're going to live in places called monasteries and convents. So these two groups of people are called monks and nuns. So what's a little bit different about the monks and the nuns and the priests are that they are going to not be doing those day-to-day services in the church. Primarily at this time, if they live in a monastery, that's all they do. So they live there, they don't really leave, they're sort of segregated inside of there, away from the rest of civilization. And part of why they do this is because they're just really trying to focus on prayer And it's almost like the meditation that we saw with the Buddhists. And so they're trying to reach that level in their minds and really have that attachment to God. Now, I want to read to you because nuns are women, and women in the Catholic Church are not allowed to be priests. They cannot run church services. They cannot become any of the different levels that there are. There's cardinals, there's bishops, the Pope. Women are not allowed to do any of that even today in the Catholic Church. So your book says here that church doctrine teaches that men and women were equal before God. But on earth, women were viewed as weak and easily led into sin. Thus, they needed the guidance of men. So they don't have a fantastic view of women in terms of jobs and decision making, even in the church. So we can see that women are definitely being, there's some prejudice against them. The church does say that the ideal woman would be Mary, who was the mother of Jesus, because she was modest and pure. And so that's the type of woman that women in the church are supposed to strive to be like. But because they were weak and led into sin, they could never really achieve that level. So that's one of the reasons why the women were not allowed to have those sort of higher roles in the church. Now, these people living in the monasteries and convents, either monks if you're a man or a nun if you're a woman, they live by something called the Benedictine rule, where basically this means that they're going to take 3 very important vows. First of all is a vow of poverty. So they agree that they're going to live a very simple life. Second is a vow of purity, which means they are not going to get married. They are not going to have those relationships, because basically the way it was described to me once, they're married to God. And then after that, they are going to have a vow of obedience. I couldn't think of the word. They're going to have a vow of obedience, not only to the people who are above them, but to God as well. So while living in these monasteries, one of the things they're going to do to be able to serve the community is to run hospitals and schools. Nuns are the very first nurses that we see in these hospitals. And a lot of these schools are going to be run by them, and that continues on much later. My dad went to a Catholic school in the 50s and 60s, and the nuns were his teachers. So that's one of the things they do. Another thing is they actually were all about agricultural methods. So basically, they're actually it's going to be in a monastery where somebody figures out genetics. So Gregory Mendel is going to be working with peas in his garden and finds that 2 different varieties of peas actually cross-pollinate with each other and create a whole brand new pea. And that's where we figure out genetics. So it's actually quite interesting, because what we find later is that we'll have this real problem between science and the church, and yet we're actually discovering scientific things right here in the church. So that's kind of an interesting thing. So they may have actually been the ones that figured out the crop rotation as well, because they worked on farmland as they were going. So third, the church power. So the Pope, who's the leader of the church, even today, he lives in Vatican City, which is a country within the city of Rome in Italy. It's its own independent country. The Pope is going to gain a ton of power during this time period. So we say that he had power over the church and the secular world. So not just the church, but also the non-religious world. And so that's actually going to mean the kings as well are going to fall under him. This is because of something called papal supremacy. So if you think about it, if you are in charge, kind of like the pharaohs were in Egypt, and you say, God told me I'm supposed to do this, and you have these very, very religious people who believe you have this connection to God, they're going to listen to anything that you say. So they actually said they had something called papal supremacy, where the Pope was supreme, which meant that there was authority over everyone, including kings. Now, think for a sec. You're a king in Europe There's lots of different kings, all these different kingdoms. And the Pope says that he is in charge of you. I feel like you're going to look at them and be like, what? No. This is my kingdom. These are my people. They listen to me, not you. I'm not going to listen to you. So what are you going to do about it? The Pope, of course, is going to have a great comeback for this. And he has got a power in his back pocket that we call excommunication. So by definition, excommunication means you get kicked out of the church. And I don't mean like they physically like remove you from the church. This means like you're not a Catholic anymore. You don't get to partake in the church services. You don't get to get the sacraments. You don't get a Christian burial. And without all of these things, according to the teachings in the church, that means no heaven for you. So that's pretty much bad news bears. This is a power that the church still has, but typically this is used only in very severe cases of people who have violated church doctrine. This is not really meant to be a, you didn't do what I said and I'm mad at you, so I'm going to kick you out of the church kind of situation, or I'm going to threaten to kick you out of the church because I think you're not going to do what I say. All of that's not supposed to be how it works, but that's definitely how these popes here during this time are going to gain their power, because they'll just always threaten to kick people out. Now, they would use this even down so low on the peasants that if they did not pay enough money in taxes to the church, that they were actually going to kick them out. So like you would come up with every last penny that you had to be able to make those payments so that you could make sure that you were saving your salvation and able to get into heaven. Which takes me into my next point. Really, these popes and these clergymen should not have been wealthy, but they were. So they're supposed to have this vow of poverty, and yet many of them don't. So basically, they're collecting tax money or tithes, which is a donation to the church, and they're pocketing it themselves. They're not using it for the poor. They're not using it to build new churches or to help anybody out. They're pocketing it. So during a time when these popes are gaining more and more power, I think that they were sort of gaining a little bit more of a sense of being in the secular world, the non-religious world. So they're wearing furs and they're wearing jewels and they're wearing gold. All of these things that you're really not supposed to do according to that Benedictine rule and those vows that they took at the beginning. So there's actually a whole lot of corruption going on during this time. Corruption is basically when you're doing something that is better for you, but not the people. We see this sometimes. It's happened in politics. It happened a few years ago in Detroit. The Detroit mayor was basically accepting bribes and taking money from the city of Detroit. Like he owes the city of Detroit like $11.8 million or something like that. So he's in prison right now for it. But corruption, that's obviously that was not what was best for the city of Detroit. And so that's what's kind of going on with corruption. But there's also reform. How can we change things and make it better? So first, we've got this group called the Friars. These are monks who did not live in the monasteries. Instead of living that secluded life, they sort of go out into the community. They're out in the villages, and they're trying to convince people that the church is not all bad, because it's not. So just because there was some corruption and some power struggles going on here, it's not all bad. So they were trying to actually convince people of that. Also, we are going to have St. Francis. So St. Francis of Assisi, he was from Italy. He grew up in a wealthy family and actually gave all of that up to become a friar. So he starts something called the Franciscans, the first order of the friars. And basically their job was what the other friars were doing. Try to convince people to stick with the church and that not everything was bad, but also to actually try and fix some of those problems that were going on. St. Francis is also the patron saint of animals, so you might have seen his statues before in somebody's yard. he's usually standing like this, and the birds will like land on his hands or like this, and it's a little bird bath. So that was St. Francis.